Yesterday on the show, we had a chance to speak to Renaud Brassard from the Montreal Economic Institute. And of course, the big issue has been tariffs. Of course, we're all waiting to see what happens on Saturday, if in fact those threatened tariffs by Donald Trump come to pass, and what it would mean not just in Canada, but in Quebec, of course, as well. But the interesting part of the story, at least from a Canadian perspective, is the fact that interprovincial trade in this country is something we have not taken advantage of. And believe it or not, there are still many barriers to interprovincial trade, something that you'd think now, given the fact we may be facing tariffs, is something the government should be looking at. And in fact, to that end, they are convening a meeting with provincial leaders to see if there's something we can do to encourage more trade between provinces. But as it turns out, in speaking to Renaud Brassard, the province with the biggest interprovincial trade barriers is Quebec. Listen to this.
It's estimated that Quebec's barriers in the field where they're being applied, so for the products where they're being applied, amount to an equivalent of a 25% tariff.
A 25% tariff, the way we are applying trade barriers here in this province. And we have, by the way, according to that report, the most of any province in Canada. I think the number was 36, compared to 7 or 8 or even 9 or 10 someplace else. So we want to find out more. Christopher Skeete, our former Minister for Anglo Relations, is now Quebec's Minister for the Economy and concerns himself with this. Chris, thanks so much for coming back on the show, and Happy New Year to you. We haven't spoken in a while. So
it's been a while, you're right.
You heard what's going on here as far as these trade barriers are concerned, interprovincially, and Quebec, the outlier here with more than anyone else. And as you just heard him say, that basically, in effect, puts a 25% tariff on our trade. So what are we going to do about this? What are we doing about this?
Well, there's two things. First of all, the 25% trade barrier, he's citing a IMF report that, while interesting, and I think there are some barriers that exist in Quebec and with interprovincial trade, doesn't tell the whole story. For instance, that study doesn't exactly measure how much Quebecers want to actually consume locally. So any local buy local initiative is going to be not represented in that barrier. So I'm not sure it's a complete portrait, but where he's right is that there is still work to be done with regards to interprovincial trade. It's one of the reasons why a free trade agreement was created between the provinces. I am Quebec's representative for that committee, and we have been meeting every year for the past few years. And the good news is we're moving in the right direction. Interprovincial trade has been growing 3% per year since 2018. So it's good news. It's going in the right direction, but there's still a lot of work to be done. It's why we're meeting on Friday.
You know, it's funny. It seems like a no-brainer, especially now when you consider what, we're being potentially threatened with by the U.S., that Canadians should be able to trade across our borders. We don't really have borders. Well, we have provincial borders, but they're not hard, fast borders. Why is this so difficult to get done?
Yeah, well, I mean, like I said, there's the perception of the barriers that exist, and there's the reality. I think oftentimes we think the perception is bigger than the actual problem. A lot of it comes down to harmonization of regulation. So, for instance, in Quebec, we can say that a truck transporting goods has X amount of a weight limit. In Ontario, it could be Y. In Nova Scotia, it could be Z. So that means that there's no harmonization between what exactly a trucker needs to carry goods over. Now, that creates problems for the economy because these people have to, manage their loads differently depending on the province that they're in, and that creates barriers. So what we're trying to do is work on those harmonizations to make sure that we do a better job there. And that's the kind of work that we're going to be looking to discuss on Friday.
So as I said off the top, the concern now, of course, is what happens on Saturday if Donald Trump follows through with those tariff threats. Does this sort of light a fire under everybody to get this done even quicker?
Well, the good news is I'm seeing this as an opportunity for us to move forward on interprovincial trade. So while I said that the problem is not as big as we often imagine it to be, there are still some issues that need to be discussed. If this can make us move in the right direction, I think this is good news. So yes, I see this as an opportunity to harmonize our processes, and Quebec is definitely open to doing that.
With respect to what the Premier has talked about in terms of Quebec pushing back, retaliatory tariffs, et cetera, where are we on this right now as far as you know?
So the official word from the Premier is that nothing is excluded. Everything is on the table, and we're willing to look at everything. But of course, we're still focused on trying to avoid the tariffs. Now, remember, we were supposed to get hit with tariffs on day one. The reality is we weren't. Let's see what happens on Saturday. We're still, doing a lot of work to speak with our American partners and American businesses to make sure that they realize that 32 out of the 50 states have Canada as their primary export partner. I think they don't realize how much this will hurt them. And of course, when we say tariffs, what we're saying is a tax on Americans. So let's just be prudent and let's try to explain to our American friends that, in fact, we're partners and that we should have a North American perspective.
We heard today that the federal government is considering helping workers in Canada, kind of going back to what we saw during the pandemic, with money being made available to workers who'll be out of job. Is Quebec preparing anything like this on its own?
Yeah, the good news is we had one of the best responses during the pandemic in terms of how we accompanied businesses. We were able to help businesses by offering them some loans and also some forgivable loans, which really, you saw some of the help that was done by other governments. Sometimes that help wasn't really targeted correctly, or sometimes it wasn't given to the right people. Our program actually did a lot of good, and we're trying to replicate that going forward. So yes, to answer your question, we are working on ways to accompany our businesses to make sure that they can face this very important threat with the help of the government.
And will that be by offering money to people who perhaps are going to be losing their jobs?
Well, there is not going to. So there's two things. There's the people who are affected by potential job losses. That's going to be dealt with differently than helping businesses that are going through the problems. So to answer that question, we're working on both those fronts.
Okay, we'll leave it there. I would ask one other thing, and I understand you're meeting now with other provincial leaders to go over this whole interprovincial thing. Are there other provinces that are holding this up, or is everyone sort of working here together?
Like I said, I think everybody has their own reasons for any exceptions that they have. Okay, and so I think it's easy to say, well, nothing's moving. The reality is we are moving in the right direction, and there is a trade agreement that exists in Canada between the provinces, and we are making progress. But again, like I said, a lot of it is in the nuts and bolts of individual regulations. How do you harmonize 10 different people's regulations in terms of transport, in terms of alcohol, in terms of who can work and how, and work permits and things like that? So it's about getting the details right. We are open, and we're going to make sure that we move the ball on this.
All right. Christopher Skeete, Quebec's Minister for the Economy. Chris, thanks so much for the time. Appreciate it.
Anytime, Aaron.